What's up, everybody? I'm Billy Ryan, and you are listening to the No One Is Watching podcast, where we explore leadership, culture, and the impact they have on high-performing teams. We can all admire the championships that are won on the field and the big profits that show up on the balance sheet. But this show is dedicated to the premise that those battles are won long before they start. Through conversations with elite performers and leaders in the world of business, sports, and life in general, we'll learn valuable lessons on how you can optimize yourself and your organization. On this episode, we're joined by David Stearns. David was most recently the president of baseball operations for the Milwaukee Brewers before resigning at the end of the 2022 season. During his tenure, Stearns presided over arguably the most successful stretch in Brewers history, which included 4 consecutive playoff appearances. We discuss his mid-career sabbatical, balancing objective data and subjective culture, and the power of vulnerability. He stepped away, not entirely from the game, but your role as GM and then ultimately president with the Brewers. And I'm curious what that experience has been for you since you've been, I won't say away from the game, but sort of certainly further away from the game.
It's definitely a different pace, and I'm sure you can relate to that when you're working in baseball, regardless of what the job is, regardless of whether it's at the commissioner's office with a club. I think some of our media members feel the same way. You're completely invested, and it never stops. And when you're in one of these roles, you don't want it to stop. You enjoy that life. You enjoy that part of it. I think we're all really, really competitive. We get into these positions because we're super competitive, and that leads to a tremendous time investment, a tremendous personal investment. And so you're constantly on. And what I've been fortunate enough to experience a little bit here now over the last couple of months, since I stepped away from the president role with the Brewers, is just a slightly slower pace, and being able to spend more time with my kids, to be able to spend less time on my phone, which is a big deal. And the phone is the smartphone, the iPhones. It's a wonderful invention. It's made us all so much more efficient. It's changed these baseball jobs tremendously. I think if you talk to GMs or presidents who were doing these jobs in the late 90s, early 2000s, they will say that the job is much different now than it was at that point, largely because of the smartphone. So. Look, I've enjoyed it. I've had a bunch of people tell me that sort of that mid-career hiatus is really valuable. And to this point, I have found it to be such.
What was the first? Did you have like a wow moment where you kind of can sort of see through the matrix a little bit now that you weren't in it every day with the bullets flying?
I think my wife and I went to a friend's wedding in Brazil in mid-December, which is something that in my previous existence you could never do. You're preparing for the meetings. You're completely in the throes of the off season. Grinding pretty hard at that point. And I was able to go to the wedding, and we were down there for 3 days. It was a quick trip, but I had my laptop, and I didn't have to open my laptop once, which was a pretty remarkable feeling, and not something that I had experienced over the previous decade and a half of my life. So you run into some moments like that. That are eye-opening. You just feel a slightly different connection to the environment you're in, to the people you're with, and so that was certainly one of those moments early on after I stepped away that I recognized I would not be experiencing if I were in my previous job. Now, I will say there are certainly moments where you look back and you recognize you're not experiencing what you were in the midst of before, right? Whether it's pitchers and catchers reporting, or the winter meetings or things like that that have become second nature, and you're not a part of that, and you recognize that as well.
Yeah, I experienced something similar where you sort of lack the perspective of sort of the rest of the world when you're in it. Like a lot of industries, I'm sure. Yep. It sort of envelops you, and it's so demanding. And I think technology is a big part of that. It does a lot of things to make our lives a lot easier, but it obviously puts demands on you that, you all hear the stories about scouts that would call in from a payphone at the motel and check their voicemail and all this other stuff and have to mail in scouting reports. And I don't think anybody wants to go back to that necessarily, but yeah, the trade-off for that is you're 24/7. And once you get, it's almost like, it's probably a poor analogy, but almost like in combat where there's just adrenaline going and you just don't have time to slow down. There's just always something that's next, right? Whether it's in season or out of season. And once you sort of miss one lap around the merry-go-round, you kind of realize like, oh, okay, there's other stuff going on, and it offers a different perspective. And I'm sure that whatever you take on next professionally, that will benefit you tremendously, just because, not just in your personal life, but professionally, as far as just having, a little bit more perspective that you've been removed from it. You can kind of take a little bit more of a global view of it.
No question. When I was contemplating this decision, I had someone suggest to me who had taken a mid-career pause that it could do wonders for sort of a reorientation to who you are. And I think that is a great way of framing it. And I have felt that. And I do think there's been a reorientation to, as you said, what's outside of baseball, and also probably how best to handle what's inside of baseball. And you get a little bit of a different perspective. Some space helps a lot. Some space for reflection. Some space to think about everything that's gone on over the period of a career or a period of time. And I've really enjoyed that aspect of this.
Yeah, you and I have both spent time at the commissioner's office, so we had a unique perspective going to a club from that. So it certainly provides you a little bit more of a 30,000-foot view to a certain regard, but you didn't have maybe the in the weeds knowledge when you went over there. And so I think just more perspective, more diverse perspective helps you in, whatever you're doing. It's going to help you be a better parent. It's going to help you be a better professional, whatever sort of stage of life you're in. So, I'm sure that'll suit you well. But there's a lot of people that, want to work in sports or think they want to work in sports. And what do you think the biggest misconception is, or that maybe something that surprised you early in your career that you're like, well, this isn't what I anticipated?
Look, I think sports is the entertainment business, and in a certain sense, it's showbiz, and what goes on behind the curtain in every entertainment business, in every aspect of show business is different than what goes on in front of the curtain. And so when you're first exposed to behind the curtain or under the stage, it's a little bit different, and you realize that there are just a ton of incredibly hardworking, smart, passionate individuals who are pulling really, really hard to make the show go on. And I think that's true whether you're working at a production studio in Hollywood, whether you're working on a Broadway show, or whether you're working for a professional sports franchise in some capacity. These are enormous operations, multi-billion-dollar operations at this point. And they've got a lot of really talented, hardworking people who are trying to make it go. And that's true on the baseball side. It's true on the business side, the ticketing side. And so I think that's always a little bit of a surprise for people when they get in the game, is the glamour the ritzy part of these businesses is what happens at 7 o'clock. It's when the big league team is on the field. And I think that's always a little bit of a surprise for people when they get in the game, is the glamour or the ritzy part of these businesses is what happens at 7 o'clock. It's when the big league team is on the field. And I think that's always a little bit of a surprise for people when they get in the game, is the glamour or the ritzy part of these businesses is what happens at 7 o'clock. It's when the big league team is on the field. in order to enjoy these jobs, and I think probably in order to be good at these jobs, you need to enjoy and gain fulfillment through what happens before and after 7 p.m. And the fulfillment and the joy really needs to come from the work itself, from the interactions with people. And I think that's what you learn pretty quickly when you get in the game, is if you're completely tied to the outcome of the big league product on a nightly basis, especially in a game like baseball where we play every single day 162 times a year, it may not be the most fulfilling venture for you. But if you gain enjoyment from the other aspects of the job, from working with good people, from innovating, from the grunt work, which we all do, even GMs and presidents are doing a lot of grunt work in these jobs, then these can be really fulfilling careers.
Yeah, you went through a rebuild process in your time in Houston. I had something similar in Atlanta. I don't know how you feel about it. Particularly toward the tail end, or maybe the middle part of that process, I almost enjoyed the off the field rebuild as much as the on the field, the player acquisition piece of it, because there was, to your point about sort of the breadth of the operation, and that's just on the baseball side. That doesn't even touch on the business side of it, which is equally, probably even bigger. I really just enjoyed sort of the off ball personnel development, staffing, putting the right people in the right place, or at least trying to, and really building out that infrastructure, which granted gets more attention now than it did, 10 or 20 years ago, but still there's probably not an understanding or appreciation for just how much goes into that. How do you feel about that? Because when you do embark on a rebuild, it's a big endeavor. There's a lot that, people focus on the wins and the losses and who's suiting up on at 7 o'clock, but there's a lot more going into those efforts.
Yeah. I think it may be true for really any stage of an organization, whether it's a rebuild, any sort of organizational development, requires that real investment in what is going on off the field. And I agree that is an enjoyable part of the job. And if you're in a leadership position, it's a great means through which to shape the organization, to put your stamp on the organization. And it involves culture setting. It involves hiring. It involves moving different pieces around, trying to create an environment where the right types of processes are implemented. And if you're a GM or a president, recognizing that you're not going to be the one who's either going to design or implement all the processes. So you better hire the right people and create the right environment so that they can allow these the right systems to emerge. And I agree that is, I think, one of the more underrated fun aspects of working in sports, and the team-oriented aspect that's created within a front office, not just among the players, can often be forged during those early stages, whether it's a rebuild or whether there's a regime change within an organization. Those early stages where everyone is really rowing hard in the same direction can be a lot of fun, and I think can be really important and beneficial for the sustained growth of the organization.
Yeah, I know there are other industries that probably fall into the same category, but I remember having a conversation with an agent, and he was kind of venting to me about some of the folks he was working with directly and indirectly, and he was kind of lamenting that, I'm paraphrasing, but sort of the caliber of people, so to speak, of sort of on his side of the ledger, he just didn't sort of like where it was going. And he's like, from his perspective, where you guys are, meaning on the club side, it was more or less, you're going to have people that are signing up for that because they want to be part of a team. They enjoy the competition piece of it. They want to be part of something bigger than themselves, and they just want to win. And on the agent side, there's, probably more financial incentives, and it's a little bit more individual and less of a team environment. And so since I've gotten away from the game, I've probably grown to appreciate that a little bit more, just how much someone asked me that recently, and how much of I suppose a team environment and sort of the way somebody's wired. I had always been around that. I grew up as an athlete and then got into professional sports. So that was just sort of my world. And then you get out of that a little bit and you realize that not everybody's wired that way. And it's hard to create those environments. And it's particularly hard when you come in, like you did in Milwaukee, right? You left. Houston had a reputation and a culture and an identity, right? And then you went into Milwaukee and you had to sort of build your own, right? And to your point, it's not a one-man show, but you have to sort of set the tone of what you wanted to do with the Brewers. What was your thought process? What was your approach early on what you wanted to accomplish from a cultural and a leadership perspective?
Milwaukee was a really interesting situation when I came aboard. They had an incredibly stable front office for a long time. Doug Melvin had run the baseball operations group either as a GM or a president for 12 years when I came aboard, which is an incredibly long time for an executive in our sport. And the Brewers had a lot of success during that period. They finished over 500 for the first time in 2 decades. I think we forget that through 90s into the 2000s, the Brewers were perennially bad baseball teams. So first they got above 500, then they made the playoffs, and they made the playoffs again. Went to Game 6 of the NLCS. Obviously drafted incredibly well, and were able to create some really elite homegrown position player talent. And so I encountered a group that was very rightfully proud of what they had built and what they accomplished, and they deserved to be proud for what they had done together. And it was a very stable group. Many members of the front office had been there throughout Doug's tenure. And so, what I tried to do first and foremost was listen. They needed to know that, I was there to hear them and learn about what was going really well at the Brewers, and then hopefully turn the dial a little bit in a direction that I thought would be beneficial for the organization. And so pretty quickly on in my time, there were some existing members of the organization who I thought emerged as leaders. And we were able to put them in leadership positions. And then certainly we brought in some voices from outside the organization as well to help complement me and help bring in some skill sets that at the time I thought might be lacking compared for where we wanted to go. But what I hope to instill in those first couple of months was really an understanding that I recognized the good that had happened in Milwaukee prior to showing up, and we wanted to continue what was going well, and then allow for some honest conversation and course correction where things weren't going well. And I think hopefully through that approach, we were able to build trust. We were able to have honest conversations. We were able to establish some vulnerability within our front office. And I think those are some traits that served us well throughout my time leading the group.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about vulnerability, because I think it's a little bit of a superpower if you can harness it the right way as a group. And I think we're in a place where I think maybe we've probably evolved past this, but for a while it was you were one of two camps when you came in as a GM. It was the new school or the old school, right? And so you were Harvard educated, never played the game. Everything that's wrong with baseball to some people when you took that seat, and other guys that sat in that chair were former players who were just had a very much on the field mentality to the game. And it got to the point, it felt like to me, it got to the point where you almost had two different factions rooting for and against different people. And I never totally understood that because, I remember you and I talking about it early in your tenure in Milwaukee, that I appreciated sort of the humility that you had to, yes, you're coming into it and with a certain skill set and background and looking at it through a certain lens, but also acknowledging that just because I don't have these tools in my tool belt doesn't mean they're not important to have, and sort of deputizing other people to go do that for you. That I think is a sign of really good leadership, for one. But also I think it's you admitting your own vulnerability and setting that tone where it's okay to say, I don't know this, I'm not good at this, but I need help. So can you guys sort of fill me in or pick me up on that? So that, I know I've told you that before, that always impressed me with you because it was very early in your time, and we had mutual ties that were with you in Milwaukee, and we were talking about some of those, and that just jumped out at me. And I said, I think David's sort of on the right path with this. And obviously your sort of resume speaks for yourself or your time there.
I appreciate that. And I think, understanding all of our limitations is probably pretty important. If you're going to have success and surround yourself with the right people. None of us, and I would say regardless of how long you've been in the game or any industry, none of us can come away with all the answers, nor frankly should we try. I think I was, I was fortunate coming in, that from a front office perspective, yes, I thought there was likely some change and turnover that was needed, but I didn't think an entire refresh was needed. There were people in the front office who were doing really good work, and I think giving those people some freedom to continue to do their work helped. And then the people we brought in, and the people who assumed some leadership roles within the organization, coming in with a sense of humility themselves and demonstrating some vulnerability themselves, and that they weren't coming in to rework everything, to redraw anything, and that anything that we did change was going to happen for a reason. We were going to explain it. We were going to seek feedback. And then ultimately, once we made a decision, we expected everyone to get on board. But it wasn't going to be a tyrannical process.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one thing that Pat Gillick is a guy that I always admired as an executive, because he obviously had a ton of success and did it across multiple organizations, but he also had a reputation for doing it in an inclusive, sort of open-minded manner, where I think the easiest thing in the world for all of us, it's human nature, is to bring in quote unquote your guys and just kind of clean house. And I never agreed with it or understood it. I eventually saw some things that at least justified it in my eyes, where we probably, I was undervaluing the importance of trust and familiarity and knowing sort of that somebody's got your back at all times and what they're all about. But Pat he would take over an organization and he would work with what he had, more or less. He would certainly supplement that with certain people and people he had history with, but it wasn't a scorched earth, get rid of everybody. That always impressed me, because it's a lot harder to do that. You don't know these folks. You don't know their background. You don't know necessarily all their strengths and weaknesses, but it can at least acknowledge that, to your point, like, hey, the Brewers were pretty good for a little while here. They had to be doing something right. Why am I just going to sort of toss out the baby with the bathwater just because, for no other purpose than my own ego, probably.
Believing that if you go into an operation with a little bit of a scorched earth mentality, you're probably going to make your job tougher. These are very robust organizations at this point. Brewers have 200 plus people in baseball operations, not including players. That's a lot of people. There are definitely some people in there, regardless of who they were working for previously, who are good at their jobs. And if you don't figure that out, if you don't determine who those people are, or who's going to mesh with you, you're frankly just making your life tougher, because you're going to have to hire even more people. You're going to have more turnover. You may have a little bit more distrust or mistrust at the beginning of a tenure. So I certainly made my share of mistakes at the front end, and made some rookie errors. But I'm also, I do think from a morale and cultural perspective, we were able to keep things on the right track at a time where a lot of people were nervous. And so I do think that is something that helped us at the front end when I took over in the fall of 2015.
Is there anything that you would do differently early in that tenure with the benefit of hindsight?
There certainly are. Some of them I'll keep to myself. But in
Sure.
broad strokes, you're making personnel decisions very rapidly, right? I mean, you're sitting down with someone. Maybe you're meeting them for the first time. Maybe you are. Maybe you've had some incidental contact throughout your respective careers, but you're sitting down with them maybe for an hour over lunch and trying to determine, based on a conversation, based on references, based on your perception of how they've done their jobs, where they can fit in your organization, if they're going to fit moving forward. And I took the job at the end of the 2015 season. And I sort of felt like by the GM meetings, which was in the beginning of November, I wanted to have my group. I knew we were embarking upon a really important,
the short on ramp.
Yeah, we were embarking upon a really important off season. There was going to be a lot of roster turnover. I knew that, and so I had a month, 5 weeks to sort of get the core front office group in place. And look, looking back, there are some personnel decisions that I think I could have handled better. I think that's the benefit of hindsight a little bit. And then seeing how things go. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I don't think enough people probably appreciate, just the sheer velocity of which decisions need to be made, particularly for somebody that was in the position you were in, because, look, we all in baseball get hired to get fired eventually. But it's a matter of, hey, here's my chance. And it's not about necessarily even putting your stamp on it or your fingerprints. It's just about getting my group together so we can go do our jobs. And, I don't know. I don't know if there are other situations that mirror that, but yeah, hey, I've got 5 weeks to essentially put my leadership team together. I mean, it's hard. You could do rounds of interviews with people that you do have history with and still get it wrong. It's just because it's just different. You don't know what you have until you're living with somebody every day. So, I mean, no one can do that perfectly. So, I think anybody, it's just, I can always appreciate, people who, they earn the right, because it's guys that have had a lengthy track record of success and have a fair bit of sort of leverage in whether it's negotiations or sort of picking their next opportunity. But whether it's a coach or an executive who's like, I don't, look, I'll sacrifice the money or I'll sacrifice whatever else, pardon me, might be involved. I want the length in the contract because I want to have a little bit of, slack to, not have to just hit the ground absolutely running in it, because everybody's gonna make a mistake when you have pressure to like, okay, first game is in 3 months, gotta go, right? Like it's a lot. And you touched on like the 200 some odd folks in baseball ops not wearing a uniform on national TV, and that's another one. Like there's no way you're gonna know those folks until even probably not after a full season. You gotta, you're going to minor league affiliates, you're going to spring training, your time with the player development and scouting staff is limited. So you're, to your point, you're sort of deputizing people to make sure that you can get their assessment and their opinions and fit all these puzzle pieces together. That's a big endeavor.
It is. And I think that's one of the things that struck me early on in my tenure in the job, is just how big of an operation it is and how spread out it is. And this is a pre-COVID world where maybe we're a little bit less comfortable with setups like this, with Zooms, with virtual meetings. But it always struck me, whether it was going down to Latin America, whether it was going to an affiliate in Montana, you see how hard everyone is working. And really what they're all doing is working towards trying to get you one extra win in Milwaukee at some point. Like all the scouts throughout Latin America, throughout Asia, who are working tirelessly to try to find the next 16, 17-year-old gem who's going to turn into Ronald Acuna. They're doing it. Yes, they love the sport. Many of them are very passionate about their job. They're passionate about helping these kids. But they're fundamentally doing it to help the Brewers win major league games. And the distance between what we are doing in Milwaukee every day and what a scout in Venezuela is doing every day is enormous. And I think one of the main leadership challenges of baseball and baseball executives is trying to shrink that distance a little bit and doing what we can to make people who are not centered in Milwaukee or wherever the big league team is feel a part of the operation, feel a part of the major league team, because ultimately that's what everyone's working for, and that's what everyone's watching at 7 p.m. So that struck me. I think it strikes a lot of people when you get into one of these leadership positions is just truly how vast the organization is, how invested everyone is, and then the distance that separates many of us on a daily basis, and the challenge of closing that distance when you can.
Yeah. I've told the story of how I started my scouting career was with Cleveland, which I know you spent some time with as well, and would run around. I was scouting the Southeast at the time, and the Twins, you couldn't hire a scout away from the Twins, and you could offer them a little bit more money. And they weren't a big market club. They were, a good, not great major league team. So, but it was what Terry Ryan and that group had sort of established there, the culture that, these folks felt valued. They were part of something. And to your point about, sort of getting that buy-in and making them feel part of it, you get up in the morning, if you're scouting Georgia, you're an amateur scout in Georgia, your life's going to be the same, whether you're putting on a Brewers polo shirt or a Rangers polo shirt or a Twins polo shirt, right? It's just a matter of who you're working with. And yeah, it's an immense challenge to do that, across a whole operation. And some of my favorite times in baseball were in Latin America, when you would go and you'd spend the mornings and it was smoking hot and you're sipping piping hot coffee on the field. And then you go down, you go to dinner with the group and you put the game on after. And man, if a Latin American player that these guys had ties to 10 or 15 years ago, in some cases, did something, these guys would just go bananas, and the joy that they would have and the pride that they would have was incredible. It was so much fun to be around. I always appreciated that, because the challenges of that job are immense, and it is almost like being dropped on a foreign planet when you're used to working in an office every day. And then you just see what these guys are up against, trying to assess a kid who's 13, 14, 15, 16 years old to try to get a sort of a trajectory on what he might be when he's 27. That was always fun. And that's just having that, again, another thing I don't think folks appreciate is just how disparate the group is, and having that connective tissue across departments and, and even just sort of affiliates, right? Like you got one in Montana, you got one in Florida. It's like, okay, we'll see you guys for 6 weeks in spring training, then we'll see you again next year, or we're seeing instructs.
Yep. Yeah, it is. It is a challenge to try to figure out what the right touch points are, and making those touch points meaningful, and not just eyewash. I think people see through eyewash really quickly, and I think it does a lot more harm than good when something is done for show. So when you're having those connective moments, when you're trying to create those touch points, they need to be meaningful. They need to be genuine, and people need to see that. I think humans, regardless of what we do, we're pretty good at sensing authenticity, and if you're coming across as inauthentic, people pick up on that pretty quickly, at least in my experience, and they tune you out, and they should tune you out.
Right.
So, authenticity is a big deal. And as we work to try to connect all these groups and all around the world, That's something we try to keep in mind, is how are we going to make these moments authentic, rather than just doing it because we feel like we should be doing it.
Yeah, I've always been envious of. I got some friends that work in the NFL, and sort of the envious of the. I'll call it an advantage. I know they have different challenges, but the ability to sort of draft and acquire players for a system, right? And there's a handful of teams that probably do that better than anybody. They go find the linebacker that fits a certain profile that goes and just outperforms anything he's done to that point in his career. And I remember, the Super Bowl several years back, I'm admitted Patriot homer, but it was the Seattle, New England Super Bowl. And, if Pete Carroll tries to come down on you like Bill Belichick, it ain't going to work, and if Bill Belichick tries to, bop around there like Pete Carroll and be the West Coast dude, players see through that in a heartbeat. And you're right. I totally agree. I think it's like the worst possible thing you can do. You're better off just sitting there on your hands and keeping your mouth shut for like months at a time than trying to be something you're not.
Yeah. If you talk to people, whether it's in baseball, or other industries, the concept of leadership styles, what's an effective leadership style, and what type of leadership style do you think works? And my response is, I think there are probably traits and characteristics, certain traits, probably a finite number of traits and characteristics that most successful or good leaders tend to have. But in terms of an individual style, it has to be so personalized. If you're trying to be a leader that you read about in a book, or saw on a TED Talk, and it doesn't fit your personality, it's not going to work. And I've seen stuff like that go way off the rails, where a person gets put into a management position or leadership position, and it's well intentioned, and the person has done the homework, and they're trying to be someone that just doesn't fit their personality, and it becomes evident. So, I do think leadership is a really personalized subject, and there's really no one straight formula that is universal for everyone.
Yeah, I think it's a big part of the role that you've been in is acknowledging or being able to sort of recognize who is a leader and who isn't. And I think we've put leadership up on this pedestal sometimes, and I'm a huge advocate of it and student of it, but some people just aren't equipped to be in a traditional leadership position as far as managing people and maybe running a department or what have you. Maybe they're better suited to manage a process or to own sort of a piece of the business in another way. And I think if you put someone in the wrong seat on the bus, then you're just asking for failure. And to your point, like they're trying, like they if it's not innate in them, if they're not comfortable doing it, of course it's going to come off as inauthentic because it's just not who they are. But they're reading or they're watching or they're just mimicking what they see, and that's going to come off as inauthentic. And that's such a big part of, again, tying it back into sort of the disparate nature of like a baseball operations department, 200 folks scattered all over not just the country, all over the world, making sure you have the right people leading those individual groups and those individual teams is so critical because they have to do it their own way. And, the way you're leading the group in the Dominican Republic has to be different than the way you're talking to, your board in Milwaukee. I mean, it's a different environment. And so you have to be able to adapt to that.
Yeah. And I think learning your own leadership style, learning your own leadership voice takes a little bit of time. I'm a different leader today than I was when I took the job, than I was when I became assistant general manager with the Astros, right? You learn yourself. Hopefully you learn sort of what you do well, and then what you don't do well, and can improve upon those aspects. But it takes time. And so you talked about putting people in charge of managing others or in charge of departments. Oftentimes we're doing that with individuals who maybe haven't been in leadership positions before, and it's going to take some time and some patience there to allow them to find the voice, to find who they are, is important. But you're right. Sometimes it's not going to work, and then probably some guidance is needed, or some correction is needed.
Well, it also takes coaching, right? And development. I mean, there's people that are, just really, really high level executors of a certain skill that they've built up over a career, and they've never had to lead. And now all of a sudden you thrust them from doer to leader, and you can't just expect it's going to like organically materialize. And that's hard too. I mean, sitting in the GM chair, you've got a million things flying at you every day. You don't really necessarily have time to really develop your staff actively every single day. But the flip side of that is if you don't do it or don't have someone else working on it for you, I mean, it's eventually going to come toppling down on you.
I think you're right. And I think you're right. When you're running an organization, I think regardless of what the organization is, you yourself likely aren't going to have time to actively focus on the career development of the vast majority of the people who are under you. With that said, I think it is incumbent upon the leader of an organization, any organization, to make it very clear to everyone else around them that staff development is really important, and coaching is really important. Coaching is not imposing your will on someone else. Coaching, effective coaches, whether it's a pitching coach or it's one manager trying to help another manager, effective coaches, there's a whole lot of give and take, and there's back and forth, and there's discussion, and there's a true desire to understand where the other person is coming from, and helping that person reach the best versions of themselves. And so while the CEO of a company or the president of a company or the GM of a baseball team probably doesn't have a whole lot of bandwidth to actively do that in broad swaths of the company, I do think it's really important that person makes it known that that's the expectation. And ultimately, that's how organizations grow and get better and succeed long term, is if there is that individual employee development, if there is a culture and a comfort of pushing each other and helping each other to achieve the common goal. And I think in sports, one benefit we have is the common goal is so clearly articulated, right? We're trying to win games. That's the common goal. Ultimately in baseball, we're trying to win a World Series. And so that is, that makes grabbing onto something unified, I think, much easier in our line of work, in my line of work, than perhaps in some other industries.
Did you have that perspective or prioritization when you took the job in Milwaukee, or did that have to evolve for you?
I think I had an appreciation for it because of where I had gone through in my career. I was incredibly fortunate that I felt like at almost every stop I made, there were people there who were actively coaching me and who were really good managers and helped me learn a ton. And I recognize not everyone is as fortunate to have those encounters early in their careers. I thought I was, and was able to work for people who genuinely cared about me, didn't sugarcoat things, were direct with me, but did so in a truly caring fashion. And it helped me grow and get better, and it gave me a tremendous appreciation for what good management and good coaching looks like. And so I do think I came into this job with an appreciation for how important that was. And that's probably only grown over my time with the Brewers.
Was that a focal point for you when you took over? I look back on my experience and your point about the great thing about sports is it's so linear and it's so tangible, right? We either win or we lose every night. And that's how we did on that particular day. Right. But I always enjoyed I was the number 2 guy. I never had to answer to it ultimately because I wasn't the GM. So I enjoyed sort of the secret society mentality of like, I know everybody wants us to do X, but we have to be disciplined and do Y instead. It's for the best interest of the organization and blah, blah, blah. But that's hard. That could be, I mean, it wasn't my butt on the line ultimately, because I wasn't the GM. And so there's that balance of like, okay, like, yes, development's important. Culture is important. Setting this tone is critical to our long-term success, but so is winning in the short term. Because if we don't win in the short term, or at least maybe not wins and losses, but win in the sense of showing progress and being able to sort of show proof of concept with what we're doing, there won't be a long term.
Yeah, we don't operate in vacuums, right? We're not in some theoretical land where we can continuously run experiments and see what happens. We have very tangible results, as you just said. We have stakeholders who are very, very invested. We have owners who are putting lots of their money and trust on the table. We have fans who are extremely passionate about the team and rightfully don't like when the team loses, regardless of what the long-term plan might be. Yes, all of those need to be factored in. And I think the specific situation a leader finds him or herself in kind of dictates how you weight different variables. No 2 situations are the same. I think a lot of these decisions, a lot of these strategic decisions, the types of which you're touching upon, are very context specific, very dependent upon where the organization has been, where you want to go, the time frame that you have to get it there, what in sports, what the ownership group is seeking. And so these are complex decisions. We don't operate in a vacuum. There are external pressures and there are external factors. And I think acknowledging those to your organization is the right thing to do. And then you do your best to make decisions that make the most sense within your specific context.
Curious, when you came into Milwaukee, I think some clubs do I think it's a small group, but some clubs do a really good job of having that connectivity between the front office and the field. And it's a different dynamic and it's delicate, and you have to sort of do that dance appropriately, or it's just, again, going to come off as inauthentic and probably overstepping. But there are teams that are super progressive and try very avant-garde things, and the players buy in and they're excited about it, and it's kind of a us against the world mentality, which I think can lead to really special things. There are others that maybe it's a little bit more of an edict and a little bit more of a, hey, just trust us, we know better. And the players are just sort of there, and they're just sort of expected to sort of do what they're told, for lack of a better word. And so I'm curious about your approach to that coming into Milwaukee on blending the more data-driven, objective philosophies or strategies with that culture and chemistry dynamic.
Yeah, I think it starts with the relationship that the front office has with the field staff, with the manager, with the coaches. That has to be a relationship of mutual trust, a relationship of mutual understanding. That doesn't mean there's always agreement. In fact, I think that relationship is better when there's not always agreement. But there, or at least that relationship is more productive when there is not always agreement. But that relationship needs to be strong, and there needs to be significant trust all around. And so that was a big focus of mine when I got the job. Is building that relationship with our field staff at the major league level. My first off season, we had a significant amount of turnover on the field staff. We were bringing in a lot of new people, and ensuring that group forged good relationships among themselves and also with key people in the front office who were going to be working with them on a day-to-day basis was really important. And that fundamentally takes time. And it takes being around, and it takes being accessible. And so for that first 2 years, I was certainly around that group of people, our field staff, and some of our chief executives in the front office were also around the field staff a lot. And it was to have the opportunity to forge those relationships and have those discussions that really occur organically. We can host meetings at the beginning of spring training, which we do. We can host check-in meetings throughout the course of camp or the regular season, which we do. But those can only do so much. I think it's the organic conversations that pop up that can really push an organization forward, that can lead to innovative thought. And that takes presence, and it takes being around, it takes patience. And so I think to get at what you alluded to, where everyone is on board, where there's a fundamental understanding of everyone rowing in the same direction, at least within baseball, it starts with that relationship between front office and field staff.
Yeah. It's I always felt that the front office, and even to a lesser extent, but still some folks were guilty on the coaching staff, avoided the direct conversation. They avoided sort of the transparency. And I don't necessarily understand why. I think you're underestimating players at that point. I mean, a lot of these guys are grown men. They have families, and, telling them they're doing a great job when they know they're not doing a great job isn't doing much for you, isn't doing much for your trust, and so being able to do that. And, I was fortunate to, my time in Arizona, I worked under Kevin Towers, who talked about sort of authentic leadership styles. And he was one of a kind, right? He was very unique in the ways that he did. And he was a former player and had that mentality to it. And that, that just resonated with not just players, but it really resonated with everybody. But he was very comfortable in that environment. And so he was able to accomplish things that others wouldn't be, because that was just his nature, right? But there's like that invisible line in the sand where you can't, you shouldn't cross, when it's front office and players. And then there are sort of official hurdles set out in front of you when you get further down the career line with some guys where, use the arbitration example, right? It's a thing that you and I both have a lot of experience in on various sort of sides of, or angles of the process. And it's, you look at it from the outside and it's like, okay, you're building the team and you've got this trust built with this player who's an integral part of your success. And, then you go into the off season and you are pitted against each other, and you're not going to tell him how bad he is, but you're going to tell him about, you're going to point out all the shortcomings to sort of prove your case about where he belongs in the salary structure. And the flip side is the player's representative is going to, sort of talk about how he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And that's a really unique challenge, I feel like, from a relationship and a leadership perspective, to be able to come out of that, which some of them, even with the best of intentions, can get contentious. It's just, there's emotion involved, and there's ego, and there's pride. And these guys are high performing, highly skilled people. And you're essentially, I don't want to say attacking, but you're kind of attacking how good they are at it. And being able to come out of that and be like, shake hands and say, okay, let's go get them in spring training. That's a really unique challenge.
Yeah. I mean, the arbitration system in baseball is just an awful system.
I'm glad you said it.
There's no one who likes this thing. And I understand, we're dealing with literally decades at this point of precedent. I understand how it got into the CBA. I completely understand why it's so different, why it's so difficult to get out of the CBA. But this is a terrible system that no one likes. And you're right. On occasion, it can lead to some bitterness. And that's not good for anyone. You do your best as an organization to forge relationships and to create trust. And then you work really hard to that when things do get bumpy, whether it's in an arbitration hearing, like you alluded to, or a personnel decision or a demotion or a lineup change or whatever it is, you work really hard so that hopefully the trust and bonds that you've built can allow you to get through some of those rocky periods. It doesn't always work. There are some decisions are made that become really painful and hurtful for players that fundamentally change their lives and not in positive ways. And you understand that. And you do have to look at some of these decisions from very different perspectives than players are approaching them.
Sure. All right. So now you're out of the grind every day, right? It's got to offer a unique perspective to you. I've got two questions. And furthermore, you've got young kids, right? Which always offer both refreshing perspective and unashamed humility when they just sort of speak to you with no filter whatsoever. So I imagine that you have some sort of takeaways from your time away from the day-to-day now that you maybe view the game differently, but probably I would imagine life in general, because it's just a very different experience being able to be more present, candidly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think just the ability to, when you have time with your kids, to be truly focused on them, and to not let the small stuff, the minor inconveniences, the delays, the messes, all that, to not let that bother you. And look, when you're running an organization, you're trying to get somewhere, or you're trying to get on a call, or you feel like you have to call someone back, or there's a game that's about to start, it's really natural for some of those really minor inconveniences to bother you and to stress you out. I think pretty quickly, you learn to kind of enjoy some of those. That's one of the fun things about parenting is rolling with the punches a little bit when you get a chance to, and so I've enjoyed that, and hopefully whatever my future professional paths lead, wherever it leads, I'll be able to take some of that perspective.
No doubt.
Perspective with me.
Yeah, for sure. And your point about sweating the small stuff, right? It's the stereotypical anecdotes about first kid versus second kid, right? And you're wiping the first kid down with baby wipes and doing everything perfect, and the second kid, you're like, all right, you'll be okay.
That's exactly right.
It's funny because my kids were still young when I got out of baseball, and every now and then it'll come up, or we'll see a game on TV, and my wife will ask my daughter, who's 7 now, hey, do you remember X, Y, or Z doing this? And she's like, well, I remember the fruit. I remember sitting in the room with the fruit in the window when we were sitting in the GM box. She would come up every now and then and have like a little fruit bowl. And I remember the big cow, because there was a giant Chick-fil-A, statue or whatever out in the outfield that she got to go up and see. And she was like, she's like 2. So it's humbling. You made the point earlier where it's an entertainment business. And I've said that as well. It doesn't feel like it. And don't get me wrong, I'm as competitive as the next guy. I want to win. And I love competition, but at the end of the day, we're not curing cancer. It is an entertainment business, and it's a very unique one and a competitive one. But again, that perspective that you talked about, that kids do a great job of providing, but even just distance, gives us a lot of it that inevitably is going to make us better as people, just in general, I would think.
I think that's right. And we've been talking primarily about baseball because that's certainly what I'm familiar with, and you had a long career in the game as well. But I think a lot of what we've talked about is true for any highly demanding job, whether you're working as a lawyer, whether whether you're a teacher. There are lots of jobs that are demanding long hours, high concentration, regular availability. And I think in any of those positions, you can get lost in it a little bit. And so for me, it's been really nice to have a little bit of a pause, reorient, and it's been fun.
So what are you doing with all your time now? You're spending time with your kids. You know, you got any good book recommendations? You working out? What are you doing?
Yeah, it's funny. Everyone asks me that. And I can't say that I have all this spare time on my hands. It is amazing. Yeah. It is amazing how you can fill time. And look, some of it's a lot of it is family, a lot of it's kids, some of it's sort of professional dabblings here or there to keep my mind going and keep me learning a little bit. I certainly have read more over the last 3-4 months than.
You got any book recommendations for me?
I've read. It's funny when you go through careers like we've had. You get all these book recommendations thrown at you about leadership, about management. And I wanted to know what people were talking about. I didn't really have time to sit down and read, a 400-page book. So inevitably I would skim them. And so, now what I've frankly gone back and do is actually read them and not skim them. So I know more than just the talking points. I've actually learned to, I've actually gotten the true principles. So, I've gone back and read all Daniel Coyle's books. I've gone back and read some Adam Grant. I love kind of American history, politics. So not necessarily leadership focused, but I've gone back and read some of Bob Woodward's books. And so I've found my way through some books, and that's been nice. It's something that you don't have a great opportunity to do in depth. You can kind of get the general sense of something, but to truly dig into a book and read everything, it's been really nice.
Yeah, it's the funny thing about books is they're way more effective when you actually read them.
Amazing.
Well, David, I really appreciate the time, man. It's been fun catching up with you. I'm excited for you as a person, as a father, and just being able to sort of take that time with your family. And I know it'll recenter you and serve you well in whatever comes next. So I'm excited to follow that, and appreciate you taking the time today.
Appreciate it, Billy. It was fun. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the No One Is Watching podcast. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe so you can be notified when a new episode drops. If you're interested in similar content, you can check us out at nooneiswatching.com or find us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. See you next time.